This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to an immersive exploration of Fenya, the secret language of the Russian underground. In this narration, we'll trace the remarkable journey of a thieves' cant that began with medieval peddlers and evolved through the brutal crucible of the Soviet Gulag. From the soulful songs of outlaws to the strategic rhetoric of the Kremlin and the encrypted corridors of the dark web, you'll discover how this linguistic mask became a powerful tool for survival and dominance. Join us as we unlock the history, culture, and enduring mystery of the Fenya language. Chapter 1. From Sacred Icons to Secret Tongues. To understand the roots of what we now call Fenya, we have to travel back to the muddy, winding roads of medieval Russia, long before the era of the high-security prison or the digital dark web. The story begins with a specific class of people known as the Fenyas. These were traveling peddlers, nomadic merchants who spent their lives wandering from village to village, carrying large portable boxes known as korobki strapped to their backs. Inside these boxes was a miniature world of commerce: ribbons, needles, household trinkets, and most importantly, religious icons. Because they specialized in the resale of these sacred images, they were often called god haulers. The Fenyas primarily hailed from the Suzdal region, an area north of Moscow that was once a powerful principality. In the Middle Ages, Suzdal was a center of craft and trade, but as political power shifted toward Moscow, the local population had to find new ways to survive. Many turned to the road. However, life as a nomadic merchant in the Russian interior was fraught with danger. An Fenya was a perpetual outsider, a man with no fixed home who carried valuable goods and cash through territories where the law was often a distant rumor. To survive, they needed more than just a sturdy pair of boots. They needed a way to speak that would keep their business secrets, their roots, and their very identities safe from the ears of curious peasants, local authorities, and the highwaymen who haunted the forests. This necessity gave birth to a crypto-language. It was not a completely new language with its own unique grammar, but rather a clever linguistic mask. The Fenyas kept the traditional morphology and grammar of the Russian language, the way words are conjugated and sentences are structured. But they systematically replaced the roots of the words with invented or borrowed terms. This created a peculiar effect where a sentence sounded like Russian in its rhythm and flow, yet remained entirely unintelligible to anyone who wasn't part of the Peddlers' Guild. They pulled these new roots from a variety of sources. Because their trade routes often brushed against the borders of the Byzantine world and the Levant, they incorporated broken fragments of Greek. They also borrowed from Yiddish, German, and various Finno-Ugric dialects found in the northern reaches of the empire. Linguists who studied these early forms of Fenya, most notably in the 19th century, documented the sheer creativity of this trade code. The great lexicographer Vladimir Dahl, in his landmark Dictionary of the Living Russian Language, provided startling examples of how this sounded in practice. In normative Russian, if someone wanted to say that it was time to go to bed because it was midnight and the roosters would soon be crowing, they would say, "Pora spat, polnoch, skoro zapoyut petuchi." But an Fenya, speaking to his companion in a crowded tavern where they didn't want to be understood, would say, "Ropa kimat, polumerkot, rychlo zakureshchat vorechani." In this version, the word for sleep became kimat, and the roosters became vorechani. Another example from Dahl shows an even more complex substitution. A sentence as simple as, "I forgot to tell you, your wife died this spring," was transformed into, "Da pazagorbil basve slemzit, astona basvinska uchalila driabotnice." Here, the word for wife is replaced with astona, and the act of dying is masked by the term uchalila. The Fenya language was a professional tool, a way to negotiate prices and discuss the quality of goods right in front of a customer without that customer knowing they were being discussed. But the stakes were raised significantly in the 17th century following a major schism in the Russian Orthodox Church. The state and the official church began a crackdown on certain religious practices and the sale of icons that did not conform to new standards. Suddenly, the Fenya's primary trade goods were potentially heretical. Their secret language evolved from a simple commercial convenience into a vital shield against religious persecution. If a government official or a hostile priest overheard them, the peddlers could claim they were simply speaking a local Suzdal dialect, a regional quirk of speech, rather than a coordinated effort to hide illicit trade. One of the most fascinating aspects of this early Fenya was the phonetic trickery used to distort common words. Peddlers would often insert specific syllables, like feng or nya, into the middle of standard Russian words. This is where the name Fenya itself is believed to have originated. By breaking up the syllables of a word and padding them with these nonsense sounds, they created a rhythmic, staccato speech that sounded like gibberish to the uninitiated. For example, the Russian word for prison, tyurma, might be stretched into tyur, fe, ma, nya. This technique was a precursor to what we might think of as Pig Latin, but used with deadly seriousness by men whose livelihoods and lives depended on remaining inconspicuous. As the centuries progressed, the Fenyas became more than just traders. They became a distinct social caste. They were often viewed with a mix of suspicion and fascination by the settled population. There are even historical theories suggesting they might have been descendants of ancient tribes like the Mazics or the Mirians, who used their ancestral tongues as the foundation for their secret speech. Regardless of their ethnic origins, their linguistic legacy began to seep into other marginalized groups. Because the Fenya spent so much time on the road and in the lower depths of urban markets, they frequently crossed paths with beggars, vagrants, and petty thieves. These groups, seeing the utility of a language that could bypass the understanding of the law, began to adopt and adapt the Fenya's vocabulary. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the language had transitioned from a trade argot into a broader underworld cant. It started absorbing more terms related to crime and evasion. The word musar, which literally means trash or garbage in Russian, began to be used as a derogatory term for the police, a piece of slang that has survived for over 200 years and is still used today. The hierarchy of the road also began to be reflected in the language. A leader or a respected elder in these traveling circles was called a Pakhan, a term that would eventually become the standard title for a high-ranking crime boss. This early version of Fenya was a living, breathing thing that changed with every new trade route and every new group of outcasts that joined the nomadic life. It was a language of the mobile poor, the people who lived in the cracks of the Russian Empire's rigid social structure. It drew heavily from Yiddish through interactions with Jewish traders in the western borderlands, and from Romany through the itinerant gypsy camps that shared the same forests and roadsides. This blending of influences made Fenya one of the most linguistically diverse argots in Europe. It wasn't just about hiding meaning, it was about building a sense of belonging and solidarity among people who were rejected by mainstream society. To speak the cant was to be part of the brotherhood, to be someone who was in the know. The transition of Fenya from the boxes of icon peddlers to the pockets of urban criminals was documented in the literature of the time. Writers like Alexander Pushkin and later Nikolai Nekrasov began to include snippets of this thieves' slang in their stories to give their characters a gritty, authentic edge. They recognized that this wasn't just a collection of random curses, but a sophisticated system of communication with its own internal logic. By the mid-19th century, the first dictionaries of criminal slang were being compiled by police officials who realized that they couldn't effectively fight crime if they didn't understand the language the criminals were using to plan their heists. One of the defining features of this pre-Soviet Fenya was its focus on the physical realities of the life of an outcast. There were dozens of words for different types of theft, for various ways to hide stolen goods, and for the tools of the trade. A razor blade used to cut open a victim's bag was called a pismo, or letter, while the actual letter or document was called ksiva. Money was famously referred to as babki, a term that originally referred to the images of Empress Catherine the Great on large banknotes, but eventually became a universal term for cash that persists in modern Russian slang. The ofenyas eventually faded away as the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of the railways made the traditional traveling peddler obsolete. But their language did not die with them. It had already found a new and much more permanent home. The secret codes that had once protected the sale of religious icons and household trinkets were now being used to coordinate the activities of a growing professional criminal class. This underworld, centered in the bustling port of Odessa and the crowded slums of Moscow and St. Petersburg, took the ofenyas foundation and built upon it a complex culture of tattoos, codes of honor, and a linguistic system that was about to face its greatest transformation. As the Russian Empire teetered on the brink of revolution, the language of the peddlers was moving from the open road into the confined, brutal world of the prison system. Chapter 2. The Gulag Crucible, Forging the Code. The transition from the chaotic, wandering world of the ofenya peddlers to the rigid, brutal landscape of the Soviet prison system marked the second great evolution of Fenya. If the medieval roads of Russia were the birthplace of this secret language, the Gulag was its laboratory and its factory. Following the Russian Civil War and the establishment of the Soviet Union in 1922, the Bolsheviks began a massive experiment in social engineering that involved the incarceration of millions. This was not just a collection of jails, it was a sprawling continent of labor camps that stretched from the frozen wastes of Siberia to the sun-scorched plains of Central Asia. In this immense, enclosed universe, Fenya was forged into a standardized, sophisticated, and deadly serious code that governed every aspect of life behind the wire. The most significant change during this period was the demographic shift within the prison population. In the Tsarist era, prisons were largely inhabited by professional criminals and the occasional political dissident. But under the reign of Joseph Stalin, particularly during the mass purges of the 1930s, the camps became a melting pot where the lowest rungs of society were forced into close quarters with the highest. Peasants, factory workers, and soldiers were thrown into barracks alongside the Soviet intelligentsia, the writers, poets, scientists, and journalists who had fallen afoul of the state. This forced proximity had a profound linguistic effect. The professional criminals, who considered themselves the elite of the underworld, used Fenya as a way to distinguish themselves from the commoners, whom they called mujiks, a traditional term for peasants that took on a derogatory tone in the camps. For the political prisoners, learning Fenya was not a choice. It was a communicative survival tool. To navigate the complex social hierarchies of the Gulag, one had to understand the language of the people who actually held power within the barracks. The official camp authorities might have had the guns, but the internal life of the prisoners was governed by the vori versus zakon, or thieves in law. This was a brotherhood of elite criminals who lived by a strict, unwritten code known as the vorovskoy zakon. A central tenet of this code was a total refusal to cooperate with the state. A true thief would not work, would not sign any official documents, and would never serve in the military. Fenya became the primary way to signal adherence to this code and to identify who was a made member of the Brotherhood and who was an outsider, or a frere. The term frere is a perfect example of how Fenya absorbed and repurposed foreign words during this era. Derived from the German word Freier, meaning a suitor or a free man, in the Gulag it came to describe anyone who was not part of the professional criminal world. A Freier was a mark, a victim, someone to be exploited. If you were a political prisoner, you were a Freier by definition, and your survival often depended on how quickly you could shed your refined literary Russian and adopt the staccato, irony-laden rhythms of the thieves' cant. This was the beginning of the great infiltration of Fenya into the broader Russian language. The members of the intelligentsia who survived the camps eventually brought these words back to the surface, but in the 1930s and 40s it was a language of the shadows. One of the most chilling linguistic developments of the Soviet era was the creation of euphemisms for the state's machinery of death. The death penalty, which the Soviet government officially referred to with the chillingly clinical phrase, the highest form of social protection, was shortened in Fenya to the single word, vaishka. This term, derived from the Russian word for highest, became a ubiquitous part of camp life. It was a word spoken in whispers, representing the ever-present threat of execution that hung over every prisoner. Similarly, the secret police, the NKVD, were referred to as Musor or as God, which literally means a reptile or a serpent. These terms were a way for the prisoners to strip the state of its perceived moral authority and assert a form of linguistic defiance that the state could not fully suppress. The standardization of Fenya occurred because the Gulag system was centralized. Prisoners were constantly being moved from one camp to another, transported in specially equipped vehicles known as avtozaks or in crowded railway wagons. As they moved, they carried their vocabulary with them. A word coined in a camp in the far north could reach a transit prison in Moscow within months. This created a unified criminal culture that had never existed before. The prison system became known in the slang as the Akademia, or the Academy. To go to the academy meant to be incarcerated, but it also implied that the prison was a place of higher learning, where a young criminal could be initiated into the secrets of the thieves' code. This initiation was not merely a matter of memorizing words. It involved navigating psychological minefields known as riddles. These were verbal traps designed to test a newcomer's dominance and his inherent understanding of the thieves' code. One of the most infamous was the two chairs dilemma, where a prisoner was asked to choose between a chair with sharpened stakes and one with more degrading alternatives. The correct answer required a linguistic and conceptual leap that asserted the prisoner's status over the guards or the situation itself. To fail such a test was to be branded a Freier, or worse. To pass was to prove one had the mental agility required for the academy. The vocabulary of this era was deeply focused on the physical realities of hunger, labor, and status. Food, or rather the lack of it, inspired a wealth of slang. Good, high-calorie food sent in packages from home was referred to as batsili na o, or O bacteria. This was a clever linguistic joke based on the fact that the Russian words for the most coveted food items, maslo for butter, miaso for meat, and moloko for milk, all end in the letter O. To have O bacteria meant you were eating well, a rarity in a system where the standard meal was a thin, greasy soup known as balanda. The distributor of this food, usually a prisoner who had made a deal with the guards, was called a balander, a position of significant, if localized, power. Status within the camp was expressed through a complex system of labels. At the top was the Pakhan, or the vor. At the bottom was the shesterka, named after the six, the lowest card in a standard deck. A shesterka was an errand boy, someone who performed menial tasks for the elite criminals in exchange for protection or a bit of extra food. Then there was the schnurr, a busybody or a cleaner who worked for the camp administration, a role that was often viewed with contempt by the true thieves. This hierarchy was reinforced by a visual language of tattoos that acted as a permanent, skin-bound resume. A prisoner's tattoos could tell you their rank, their criminal specialty, and how many times they had been convicted. Fenya and tattoos were two parts of the same system. You couldn't fully understand one without the other. Irony and inversion remained the hallmarks of the language. To steal was not called stealing. It was jokingly referred to as kupit, or to buy. This inversion reflected the criminals' view that they were simply engaging in a different form of commerce, one where the price was the risk of being caught. The thieves' lexicon was also rich with animal-based metaphors that transformed mundane objects into a secret menagerie. A mirror, for instance, was a monkey, perhaps reflecting the distorted, grimacing faces of the inmates. A folding knife was often called a fox, suggesting a tool that was clever, hidden, and quick to bite. These metaphors sat alongside more famous terms like the spaller for a gun, or the pero, or feather, for a knife. The use of the word feather for a knife is particularly evocative. It suggests something light, quick, and silent, a tool that could be used and then discarded in an instant. This kind of metaphorical thinking allowed prisoners to discuss illicit activities right in front of the guards. If a prisoner said he was going to use his feather to write a letter, he might be telling his companion that he was planning a stabbing, while the guard overheard what sounded like a mundane request for stationery. The concept of betrayal was perhaps the most linguistically developed area of Gulag-Fenya. In a world where an informant could mean the difference between life and death, there were dozens of words for snitches. They were called suki, or bitches, and stuchachi, those who knock on the guard's door to whisper secrets. The act of informing was called barabanit, or to drum. The conflict between the traditional thieves who refused to cooperate and those who made deals with the administration eventually led to the bloody brawls known as the Bitch Wars in the post-World War II period. The language of this conflict was incredibly violent and specific, reflecting a world where the thieves' code was being torn apart by the pressures of the state. Stalin was well aware of the power of this parallel culture and made numerous attempts to crush it. As early as 1930, official Soviet magazines began to decry thieves' songs and the use of criminal slang as a dangerous affront to proletarian culture. The state viewed Fenya as a remnant of the decadent capitalist past that had no place in the new socialist utopia. They attempted to replace it with a new, ideologically pure vocabulary of labor and progress. But the language of the camps proved to be remarkably resilient. It was a natural response to the dehumanizing conditions of the Gulag. When the state tried to turn a man into a number, he used Fenya to reclaim his identity as part of a brotherhood. When the state used high-minded rhetoric about social protection, the prisoner used the word vishka to describe the reality of the executioner's bullet. The psychological impact of this language cannot be overstated. Fenya was a way of setting oneself against society. It was an anti-language that viewed the rest of the world as a collection of luchs, dolts or marks who deserved to be fleeced. This worldview was inherently predatory, yet it also provided a sense of solidarity and mutual support within the criminal community. To speak Fenya properly, to botat po Fenya, was to demonstrate that you were a person of status, someone who knew the rules and could not be easily intimidated. It was a performance of toughness and street smarts that was essential for survival in the barracks. As the 1930s turned into the 1940s, the Gulag population continued to swell, and the influence of Fenya continued to grow. The language began to absorb more technical terms as prisoners were put to work on massive industrial projects like the White Sea-Baltic Canal. New words were invented to describe the tools of forced labor and the various ways to avoid it. To feign sickness or madness was called kosit, or to squint. This term is still used in modern Russian to describe anyone who is trying to dodge their responsibilities, particularly military service. The fact that a word born in the desperate conditions of a Stalinist labor camp is still a common part of everyday speech today is a testament to the enduring power of the Gulag's linguistic legacy. The language also developed specific terms for the act of robbery in different contexts. A gobstop was a street mugging, a term that is still widely recognized across Russia. A pickpocket was a shipach, from the word for pinch, while a burglar who specialized in apartments was a skokar. Each of these specialties had its own sublexicon, a set of terms that described the specific tools and techniques used in that particular branch of crime. If a pickpocket's assistant moved a victim into a better position to be robbed, he was called a tirschik. This level of specialization shows that Fenya was not just a collection of random slang. It was a professional language, as complex and nuanced as the jargon of any legitimate trade. The role of the intelligentsia in the camps was particularly interesting from a linguistic perspective. While many political prisoners were initially horrified by the foul-mouthed, violent world of the career criminals, they eventually found themselves adopting the slang out of necessity. Some even began to find a kind of dark romance in it. They saw Fenya as a raw, authentic expression of the Russian soul, a language that was untainted by the wooden, bureaucratic rhetoric of the Soviet state. This fascination would eventually lead to the creation of a whole genre of camp literature, where writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Varlam Shalamov used Fenya to bring the horrors of the Gulag to life for a global audience. But during the Stalin years, this literature was written on scraps of paper and hidden in the linings of coats, a secret record of a secret world. The dehumanization of women in the camp system was also reflected in the language. Female prisoners, who often faced horrific abuse, were referred to with mocking, derogatory terms like dvustvolka, meaning double-barreled, or shalava. The only woman who commanded any respect in the criminal worldview was the mother of a thief, a figure who was often sentimentalized in thieves' songs, even as other women were treated with utter contempt. This misogyny was a core part of the thieves' code, a way for the male prisoners to assert dominance in an environment where they were otherwise powerless. By the early 1950s, the Gulag had become a massive, self-sustaining linguistic ecosystem. It was a world where a person could be killed for using the wrong word or for failing to understand a subtle linguistic cue. The language was a minefield, and navigating it required constant vigilance. But it was also a source of pride. For the professional criminal, Fenya was a badge of honor, a sign that he had survived the academy and emerged as a true man of the underworld. He didn't just speak the language, he lived it. The code, the tattoos, and the slang were all part of a single, cohesive identity that stood in total opposition to the Soviet state. The death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 brought a sudden, dramatic end to this era of total isolation. The massive amnesties that followed meant that over 1 million prisoners were suddenly released back into a society that they had not seen for years or even decades. They carried with them the scars of the camps, the rules of the thieves' code, and most importantly, the language of the Gulag. This mass return would trigger a culture shock that would change the face of the Soviet Union forever, as the secret codes of the barracks began to flood into the taverns, the factories, and the homes of ordinary citizens. The year 1953 stands as a tectonic shift in the history of the Russian language, a moment when the heavy iron gates of the Gulag swung open and released a linguistic flood that the Soviet state could never truly contain. Following the death of Joseph Stalin in March of that year, the Soviet Union entered a period of profound uncertainty and eventual transformation known as the Khrushchev thaw. One of the first and most consequential acts of this new era was a series of massive amnesties. Over 1 million prisoners, many of whom were petty criminals and survivors of the harshest labor camps, were suddenly released and allowed to return to their homes in Moscow, Leningrad, Odessa, and thousands of smaller towns across the vast Soviet interior. They did not return alone. They brought with them the entire cultural and linguistic ecosystem of the camps. This was the beginning of the Great Infiltration, a process where the secret codes of the thieves' world began to merge with the everyday life of the Soviet citizen. The return of the Zeks, as the former prisoners were known, created an immediate and jarring culture shock. For decades, the Soviet public had been fed a diet of official optimism. Anthems about industrial progress, tractor production, and the inevitable triumph of socialism. But in the crowded communal apartments, or kommunalki, and the smoky drinking dens of the post-war era, a different kind of voice began to be heard. It was the voice of the blutnoi, the honorable criminal, singing about betrayal, the freezing winds of the Kolyma camps, and the heartbreaking reality of a youth lost behind barbed wire. This was the rise of blutnaya pesnya, or thieves' songs, a genre that would eventually evolve into what is modernly called Russian chanson. These songs were the primary vehicle through which Fenya, the secret cant of the underworld, bypassed the official censors and entered the collective consciousness of the nation.
The power of these songs lay in their raw, human alternative to the wooden rhetoric of the state. While the Ministry of Culture regulated every word of official music, the thieves' songs thrived in the shadows. They were typically performed with a single acoustic guitar, an accordion, or perhaps a small informal ensemble. The lyrics were packed with Fenya, used not just for secrecy anymore, but to establish a kind of street credibility and authenticity that official culture lacked. In these songs, money was referred to as babki or kapusta, while weapons were described using terms like shpaler and pero. Informants were labeled as suka or stukach. To sing these songs correctly, one had to botat pafenya, to talk the cant. And for millions of Soviet citizens who had no personal connection to crime, this language became a symbol of countercultural resistance.
The dissemination of this music required a level of ingenuity that mirrored the criminal world itself. Because the state-run record label, Melodia, held a total monopoly and would never dream of recording an underground ballad about a prison break, entrepreneurs turned to a DIY technology that has since become legendary: jazz on bones. Using discarded hospital X-ray sheets, which were made of a flexible plastic that could hold a groove, these underground bootleggers used homemade lathes to cut records. A buyer could walk into a back alley and purchase a song etched onto a translucent image of a human rib cage, a skull, or a broken femur. There was a grim poetic irony in this. The physical objects exposed the hidden injuries of the Soviet populace, while the music they carried gave voice to the hidden suffering of the camps. These X-ray discs allowed the rowdy, bawdy tales of sex, robbery, and exile to circulate through the USSR, creating a subversive folklore that linked the intelligentsia with the criminal underworld. This period saw a fascinating flirtation with criminal culture among the Soviet elite and the intelligentsia. Writers, poets, and journalists who had survived the Gulag as political prisoners began to regularly use Fenya in their private writings and, eventually, in their published works. They saw the language not as a sign of degradation, but as a tool of survival and a way to mock the state's perceived moral authority. For many, the criminal world represented a form of folk culture that had been suppressed by the official party. By adopting the slang, they were claiming a piece of an older, more authentic Russia that the revolution had tried to erase.
This linguistic subversion eventually birthed a unique subgenre of underground humor where the pillars of high culture were irreverently translated for the street. Satirists began retelling well-known classical tales, most famously Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, entirely in Fenya. In these versions, the star-crossed lovers were transformed into young members of rival criminal gangs, and their tragic end was narrated with the cold, ironic detachment of the prison yard. These parodies served a dual purpose. They provided a dark comedic relief for an exhausted populace and acted as a biting commentary on the perceived absurdity of a society where the language of the camp had become more expressive and relevant than the language of the state. This resulted in a linguistic merger, where words that were once strictly cryptic began to lose their secrecy and become part of common spoken Russian.
Take, for instance, the word malina. In normative Russian, it simply means a raspberry. But in the world of Fenya, it had long been used to describe a criminal hideout or a den of thieves. After the mass amnesties, the word began to shift in the public mind. It came to represent a sweet, easy life or a place of freedom, derived from the Yiddish word for bright or beautiful. When a Russian today says that life is not like a raspberry, they are using a phrase that traveled from the Jewish quarters of old Odessa through the barracks of the Gulag and into the modern kitchen. Similarly, the word halyava, which refers to something obtained for free or a giveaway, has a deep history. It is derived from the Hebrew and Yiddish word for milk. In the 19th century, milk was often given for free to poor students or prisoners in certain imperial institutions. Through the medium of Fenya, this specific act of charity was transformed into a universal term for a freebie, a word that every Russian speaker uses today, often without any knowledge of its prison origins.
The songs themselves became cultural landmarks. One of the most famous, Taganka, named after an infamous transit prison in Moscow, is a mournful tango that addresses the prison itself as if it were a sentient being that destroyed the singer's youth. Its fatalism resonated deeply with a public that felt trapped by the rigidity of Soviet life. Another staple of the genre was Gopsus Maikom, a theatrical character portrait of a high society thief. In the language of the song, gop refers to a street mugging, while a smike is a violin bow, slang for a master key. The protagonist is a master of his craft who can pick a pocket, break into a safe, and charm his victims with a violin. These songs weren't just about the mechanics of crime, they were about the identity of the Blutnoi as an honorable member of a shadow society that refused to bow to the authorities.
As the 1960s and 70s progressed, the advent of the cassette tape accelerated this infiltration. It became much easier to record and hide tapes than it was to hide X-ray discs. The gravelly voices of underground artists like Arkady Severny began to thunder through the courtyards of Moscow and Leningrad. Severny, though he never served time in prison himself, was a master of the genre, performing songs that were packed with Fenya and delivered with an unrepentant, gritty energy. He became a cult hero by channeling the spirit of the Odessa Underworld, a place that had always been the mythic capital of Russian crime. His recordings were often made at informal gatherings in communal apartments, where neighbors would gather behind closed doors, singing quietly to avoid the ears of informants. These gatherings were a primary site of linguistic exchange, where the slang of the returned prisoners was picked up and adopted by the younger generation.
The influence of Fenya also began to appear in the world of Soviet cinema, albeit in a more sanitized and humorous form. A whole subgenre of Russian comedy emerged that relied on the audience's growing familiarity with criminal slang. The most iconic example is the 1971 film Gentlemen of Fortune, where a mild-mannered kindergarten teacher is forced to impersonate a brutal crime boss. The humor in the film comes almost entirely from his attempts to master the nuances of Fenya, to learn how to properly insult a cellmate as a radish, or to use the term musur for a police officer. The fact that a mainstream Soviet film could base its entire premise on prison slang shows how far the language had traveled from the secret trade codes of the Fenyas. It was no longer a cryptic shield. It was a cultural shorthand that everyone understood, even if they wouldn't admit to it in polite society. This era also saw the development of what we might call the criminal worldview in the general population. Because the language of the thieves was so expressive and colorful, it began to color the way people thought about their relationship with the state. The concept of the luch, the simpleton, or the mark who is easily fooled, began to be applied to anyone who believed too strongly in official propaganda. The criminal's contempt for the non-criminal, the friar, was adopted by the youth as a form of rebellion. They began to use words like chuvak, a slang term for a guy or a dude, which some linguists believe has roots in a word for a castrated camel, though in the context of the street, it was a marker of belonging to the cool, informal world of the underground.
The dehumanization of authority figures remained a core part of this linguistic expansion. The term musor was joined by other derogatory labels like ment. These words were used to strip the representatives of the state of their dignity.
When a teenager on the street used these terms, they were participating in a tradition of resistance that had been perfected in the Gulag. They were signaling that they were not part of the official, compliant society, but belonged instead to the world of the street, where toughness and loyalty to one's own crew were the only things that mattered. This street culture, heavily influenced by the Gopniki, petty street punks who used a simplified, curse-laden version of Fenya, became a dominant force in the urban landscapes of the late Soviet period. The mass amnesties of 1953 didn't just release people. They released a philosophy of survival. The axiom of the professional criminal, "Don't soil your hands on a dirty barrow," became a metaphor for a general refusal to participate in the state's industrial projects. This attitude was reflected in the language of work. To work hard was called vklivat, a term that suggests being driven in like a stake, while to avoid work through deception was to kosit. These terms moved from the labor camps into the factories and offices, describing a workforce that was increasingly disillusioned with the promises of communism. The language of the Gulag provided the perfect vocabulary for this disillusionment, offering a way to describe a life of hardship and systemic cruelty with a dark, fatalistic humor. By the time the Soviet Union began to disintegrate in the late 1980s, the infiltration was complete. Fenya was no longer an underworld secret, it was a national dialect. It had penetrated the music, the literature, and the daily speech of the entire population. The distinction between the professional criminal and the law-abiding citizen had been blurred by decades of shared linguistic space. This provided the foundation for the next great era of the language, as the collapse of the central state allowed the criminal world to emerge from the shadows and take a leading role in the new capitalist reality. The secret codes of the icon peddlers and the survival tools of the Gulag prisoners were about to find a new home in the boardrooms and the halls of power, as a new class of Russians prepared to lead the country into a chaotic future. Chapter 4: The Pakhan in the Kremlin.
By the turn of the millennium, the Russian language was undergoing what sociolinguists have called a landslide of the norm. The rigid wooden structures of Soviet officialese had collapsed along with the state itself, leaving a vacuum that was quickly filled by the most vibrant and aggressive linguistic force in the country, the thieves' cant. But this wasn't just a phenomenon of the streets or the newly minted business class. In a surprising and transformative era of Russian history, the secret codes of the Gulag began to echo through the gilded halls of the Kremlin. This was the birth of Kremlovskaya Fenya, or Kremlin Fenya, a strategic deployment of underworld slang by the highest levels of the political elite to signal toughness, populist appeal, and a total rejection of Western diplomatic norms. The pivotal moment for this linguistic shift occurred in September 1999. Vladimir Putin, then a relatively obscure, newly appointed prime minister, was addressing the Russian public during a period of intense national anxiety following a series of apartment bombings and the beginning of the Second War in Chechnya. Speaking about the pursuit of terrorists, he uttered a phrase that would define his political persona for decades: "We'll soak them in the outhouse," or "machit ikra sortir." To a foreign observer, the phrase might have sounded like a crude but colorful metaphor. However, to any Russian who had grown up in the shadow of the Gulag, the meaning was chillingly specific.
When Putin promised to soak his enemies, he didn't need a translator. The Russian public had been culturally primed for decades to understand the nuances of the criminal tongue. A major factor in this linguistic literacy was the cultural legacy of the 1971 film Gentlemen of Fortune. By using the phrase, "soak them in the outhouse," he was signaling that the state would deal with its enemies not through the slow, formal processes of international law, but through the immediate, brutal methods of the criminal world. The public reaction was electric. While some members of the old intelligentsia were horrified by the vulgarity, the vast majority of the population felt a sense of relief. They heard a leader who spoke their language, someone who understood the raw reality of the street.
This tough guy linguistic persona was not just a political tactic, it was a marketable brand. By 2003, the image of the president as a decisive, street-smart leader was immortalized in the pop hit I Want Someone Like Putin. The song, which topped the charts, depicted a man who didn't drink, didn't get into fights, and spoke with the authority of a real mujik. It illustrated how the linguistic markers of the underworld had been sanitized and sold back to the public as the ultimate standard of Russian masculinity.
This wasn't an accidental slip of the tongue. It was a reflection of a deep-seated cultural fascination that traced back to Putin's own youth in Leningrad. Growing up in the rough post-war courtyards of the city, he was immersed in a world where the lines between athletes, soldiers, and criminals were often blurred. A key figure in this development was his sambo and judo coach, Leonid Usvyatsov. Usvyatsov was a formidable man who had served nearly 20 years in prison. He was a man of the underworld who nevertheless held a position of respect as a mentor to young men. When Usvyatsov was shot dead in a gangland hit in 1994, his tombstone bore an epitaph that perfectly captured the worldview he passed on to his students. I'm dead, but the mafia is immortal. This connection to the criminal underworld through sport and street life provided the future president with a fluency in Fenya that felt authentic rather than rehearsed. Throughout his presidency, he continued to pepper his official communiques with salty phrases and criminal idioms. In 2006, when discussing allegations of rape against the Israeli president Moshe Katsav, Putin was overheard remarking that Katsav had turned out to be a mighty man who raped 10 women and that we all envy him. In 2011, responding to opposition protesters who wore white ribbons as a symbol of reform, he remarked that, from a distance, they looked like they were wearing contraceptives or condoms. These were calculated linguistic strikes designed to belittle his opponents by using the derogatory hypermasculine framework of the Thieves' Code.
The strategic use of this slang also extended to international relations, where it served to baffle and intimidate foreign diplomats. In 2013, when discussing the political consolidation of the European Union, he remarked that no matter how one acts during the wedding night, the result has to be the same. In 2018, speaking about the possibility of a global nuclear war, he said that we as martyrs will go to paradise, and they will simply croak, using the slang verb sdochnut, which is typically reserved for the death of an animal. Perhaps the most controversial use of this style occurred in 2022, shortly before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Addressing Ukraine's reluctance to follow the Minsk Accords, he used a phrase from a dark, folk-style rhyme, "Whether you like it or not, be patient, my beauty." The phrase, which carries strong connotations of sexual violence and forced submission, was a clear signal that the Thieves' Code, where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, was now the guiding principle of Russian foreign policy.
The most visceral manifestation of this linguistic strategy emerged not from the Kremlin's press office, but from the muddy trenches of the Donbass and the high-walled colonies of the Russian penal system. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner Group and himself a former convict, became the living embodiment of Cyber-Fenya. When he toured prisons to recruit soldiers for the invasion of Ukraine, he didn't speak the language of patriotism or military duty. He spoke the pure, unadulterated cant of the underworld. His public rants, filled with prison slang and threats of extrajudicial justice, were the final proof that the Thieves' Code had been fully mobilized for state goals. Prigozhin's rhetoric bridged the gap between the president's tough guy persona and the actual mobilization of the criminal world for the state's survival. This trend of Cyber-Fenya had a profound impact on the rest of the Russian political class. Officials and bureaucrats, eager to demonstrate their loyalty, began to adopt similar patterns of speech. The language of the state began to mirror the language of the barracks. In the world of Fenya, the person who speaks the cant is the one who holds the power. By using this language, the elite were signaling that they were above the law.
They were the ones who set the rules, and anyone who didn't understand the slang was marked by the outsider status of the friar. The cultural reinforcement of this worldview was supported by the elite's own taste in music. Sergei Roldugin, a renowned cellist and a close friend of the president, was famously linked to a network of offshore accounts. Yet in his personal life, he shared a fascination with the chanson genre, the modern evolution of the old thieves' songs. He and his inner circle reportedly enjoyed the music of émigré crooners like Willy Tokaryev, particularly songs that celebrated the life of the recidivist criminal. One of their favorite lyrics, "Where thieves humanists, where all recidivists," perfectly captures the paradoxical self-image of the modern Russian elite. Men who see themselves as honorable outlaws operating in a world where the official rules are just a facade for the true power of the brotherhood. However, the state's relationship with Fenya remained deeply contradictory. The hypocrisy of this linguistic dominance is laid bare by the state's internal policies. In January 2016, the Russian Ministry of Justice officially banned prisoners from using Fenya in pretrial detention centers, prohibiting both guards and inmates from using the language. The official justification was an attempt to encourage family values and the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church. Yet, as the 2022 invasion of Ukraine unfolded, the political elite leaned harder than ever into the language of the barracks. The state had effectively monopolized the slang, criminalizing its use by the very people who created it, while using it as a primary tool of international diplomacy and domestic mobilization.
This paradox reveals the true function of Kremlovskaya Fenya. It is a tool of dominance. The elite have claimed the right to use the language of the underworld as a form of linguistic capital, while denying that same capital to the people who actually live in the criminal world. It signals that the state has successfully co-opted the power of the Thieves' Code. The president now occupies the role of the Pakhan, and his command of Fenya is a sign of his absolute authority over both the legal and illegal worlds. The impact on the general population has been a normalization of the criminal worldview. When the highest officials in the land use the language of the Gulag, the values of that world, the contempt for weakness, the suspicion of outsiders, and the belief that might makes right, seep into the collective psyche. In this environment, the traditional legal system is superseded by the krisha, or the roof. While the term originated in the protection rackets of the 1990s, it evolved into a foundational socio-political concept. A krisha is a system of high-placed patronage that provides immunity and opportunity. In the world of Kremlovskaya Fenya, the state itself is the ultimate roof, and the president is the Pakhan who ensures the stability of the structure. To exist without a roof is to remain a vulnerable outsider in a society that has adopted the predatory ethics of the camp.
The police are seen through this lens as just another rival gang, often dismissed with the derogatory label of musor, rather than representatives of a neutral legal system. This erodes the very concept of the rule of law, replacing it with the necessity of finding protection. This cultural shift turns the entire nation into a kind of metaphorical jail. The prison discourse, once confined behind barbed wire, has become the daily political language of the country. It creates a culture where people are no longer repelled by the predatory ethics of the underworld, but instead begin to subconsciously identify with them. They learn to filter their speech, navigating a social landscape that feels increasingly like a prison yard, where one wrong word can lead to disaster. The linguistic turmoil of the post-Soviet era has thus resulted in a strange synthesis where the language of the rebel has been co-opted by the state. As this political elite began to age and the world around them continued to change, their linguistic strategies had to evolve once again. The rise of the Internet and the digital revolution presented a new set of challenges and opportunities for the Thieves' Code. The crude, visceral language of the outhouse was about to meet the cold, anonymous world of the dark web.
The transition from the physical barracks to the virtual space of cybercrime would mark the next frontier for Fenya, as the ancient codes of the Russian underworld prepared to go global in a way the Fenya peddlers could never have imagined.
Chapter 5. The Digital Frontier, Cyber-Fenya and the Dark Web. As the 21st century dawned, the physical walls of the Russian prison system and the geographic borders of the former Soviet Union were no longer the primary boundaries of the criminal world. The digital revolution provided a vast, anonymous territory that was perfectly suited for the next evolution of the thieves' cant. A new generation of Russian-speaking outlaws began to adapt this linguistic legacy to the cold, glowing world of computer screens and encrypted servers. This is the era of Cyber-Fenya, a hybrid dialect where the ancient survival codes of the Russian underworld have merged with the technical jargon of the global hacker community. The transition began in the late 1990s on the early Russian Internet, often called the Runet. This was a time of linguistic experimentation, identified by academic Larisa Morkoborodova as a period of anti-literacy. This movement, which she documented through its Manifesto of Anti-Literacy, encouraged a deliberate departure from standard formal Russian in favor of a playful, often phonetic way of writing. This grew into what is known as Podonkovsky jargon, or Albanian, a specific Internet slang that mirrors the rhythmic distortions of the original peddler speech. By intentionally misspelling words and breaking grammatical rules, users created a digital mask that allowed criminal slang to take root in the virtual space. As the first generation of cybercriminals began to organize on dark web forums, they reached back into the linguistic arsenal of the underworld to find the tools they needed to identify insiders and exclude the uninitiated.
In this new digital arena, established Fenya words have taken on startling new meanings. The word musar has undergone a modern transformation. On a dark web forum where cyber attacks are coordinated, a musar refers specifically to a law enforcement officer or a federal agent who has successfully infiltrated the thread under a false identity. When a hacker warns his companions that there is trash in the thread, he is using a centuries-old linguistic marker to signal a very modern thread of digital surveillance. This continuity allows cybercriminals to maintain a sense of historical connection to the thieves in law, even if they have never set foot inside a physical prison. The concept of the academia has also shifted into the virtual realm. Today, the academia refers to the specialized forums and private chat rooms where novice hackers are initiated into the techniques of ransomware, phishing, and data theft. To have graduated from the academia in the digital sense means to have successfully executed a high-profile attack or to have survived a brush with the authorities without snitching. The social hierarchy remains just as rigid as it was in the barracks. A made member of the cyber underworld is still an autoritet, while those who perform menial tasks like data entry or low-level scamming are viewed as the digital equivalent of the shesterka.
Expert Roman Sanikov has described this hybrid communication style as a form of convergent evolution. Criminals and technology experts both have a natural predilection for insular jargon that excludes the uninitiated. When these two groups merge, the result is a language that is incredibly difficult for outsiders to interpret. For example, Bobkey is now used to describe Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. A spaller might now refer to a specific piece of malicious software or an exploit used to breach a secure network. These euphemisms act as a layer of encryption that sits on top of the actual computer code, making it difficult for automated monitoring tools and artificial intelligence to pick up on the intent of the conversation. Modern lexical shifts have introduced entirely new terms into the Cyber-Fenya lexicon to account for new technology. The word pedal or pedal has become common slang for a cell phone, the essential tool for mobile coordination and two-factor authentication bypasses. Meanwhile, the word shablon, which traditionally means a template, has been repurposed to refer to police or military headwear, specifically the helmets worn by tactical units during raids. These concrete examples show how the language adapts to the physical tools of modern law enforcement and the hardware of the digital age.
These euphemisms act as a layer of encryption that sits on top of the actual computer code, making it difficult for automated monitoring tools and artificial intelligence to pick up on the intent of the conversation. The concept of the Melina, or raspberry, has also found a specific digital application. In the context of cybercrime, hiding in a raspberry no longer means retreating to a physical basement or safe house. Instead, it refers to the use of bulletproof hosting providers, encrypted nodes, or secure virtual private servers where stolen data is stashed and where criminals can operate with relative impunity. The digital Melina is a sanctuary of code rather than brick and mortar, yet it serves the exact same purpose as the hideouts of the 19th century underworld. The preservation and popularization of this slang for a digital native generation have been significantly aided by modern media, particularly video games. Titles like Stalker and Cyberpunk 2077 have become major vehicles for Fenya. In the Stalker series, which is set in a fictionalized zone around Chernobyl, the characters speak a gritty, Fenya-heavy dialect that has introduced millions of players to terms for robbery and betrayal. In the Russian localization of Cyberpunk 2077, the scavenger gangs use a sophisticated blend of futuristic tech speak and traditional prison cant. These games act as a cultural bridge, ensuring that the language of the Gulag remains relevant and cool to a generation that has no direct memory of the Soviet era.
Artificial intelligence, despite its massive processing power, often struggles with the nuances of Cyber-Fenya because the language is a moving target. Just as the original peddlers used phonetic trickery, modern hackers use the Podunka-Skovsky style of phonetic misspelling and technical abbreviations to create a linguistic environment that defeats automated translation and sentiment analysis. If a monitoring algorithm is programmed to look for the word for robbery, the criminals will simply switch to a more obscure term or a misspelled variation. This linguistic agility is a direct inheritance from the Suzdal roads, repurposed for the era of big data. The use of Fenya in the digital space also serves a psychological purpose, signaling legitimacy and group identity in a world where you can never see the face of the person you are talking to. By using specific, historically grounded slang, a hacker can demonstrate that they are part of the Russian-speaking criminal tradition. It establishes a level of trust that is difficult to replicate. If a user on a forum can talk the cant with the right rhythm and the right choice of words, they are signaling that they are a professional who understands the unwritten rules of the underworld. This street cred is essential for conducting business in a landscape where betrayal is a constant threat.
The concept of the Krisha, or the roof, has also found a new life online. In the digital world, a cybercriminal's roof might be a corrupt official who provides them with immunity from prosecution. Or it might be a powerful criminal syndicate that provides the technical infrastructure and money laundering services needed to hide their haul. To have a solid roof means you can operate with confidence, whereas being without a roof makes you a Fenya, a mark, who is vulnerable to both the police and other criminals. The language used to discuss these arrangements remains steeped in the traditions of the barracks, even when the roof is being negotiated over an encrypted chat. The global nature of cybercrime means that Fenya is no longer confined to the Russian-speaking world. As Russian hackers have become some of the most prominent players in the international underworld, their slang has begun to leak into other languages. Investigators in the United States, Europe, and Asia now have to familiarize themselves with terms like gopstop and musor if they want to understand the communications they are intercepting. The Ofenya's legacy has become a global linguistic force, a shadow language that mirrors the expansion of Russian criminal influence across the Internet. The role of irony and dark humor remains a defining feature of Cyber-Fenya. Hackers often use self-deprecating or mocking terms to describe their own activities. To successfully breach a high-security server might be jokingly referred to as kupit, or buying the data. This linguistic inversion serves to normalize the criminal act and to strip the victim of their perceived superiority. In the eyes of the cybercriminal, the large corporation or the government agency they are attacking is just another loch, a mark that was too slow or too stupid to protect their own assets. This predatory worldview has birthed the term lochatron, a clever linguistic play on the Fenya word for victim and the lotatron, or lottery drum. Originally used to describe street-side con games that appeared legitimate but were rigged to ensure there were never any winners, the term has found a new life in the digital age. Today, a lochatron refers to the sophisticated phishing sites, fake cryptocurrency exchanges, and fraudulent investment platforms that populate the dark web. Virtual traps designed to harvest data and drain wallets while maintaining a veneer of professional legality.
The dehumanization of the enemy also continues in the virtual space. Just as the prisoners had dozens of words for informants, the digital underworld has developed a complex vocabulary for those who cooperate with the authorities. The act of informing is still called drumming or knocking. The fear of the suka, the bitch who betrays the brotherhood, is just as intense on a dark web forum as it was in a Siberian barracks. The language used to discuss the punishment for such betrayal remains visceral and violent, serving as a constant reminder that even in the anonymous world of the Internet, the rules of the Thieves' Code are still enforced. Cyber-Fenya also incorporates numerological codes and symbolic references to playing cards. In the camps, a prisoner's status was often expressed through card game jargon. On digital forums, these same symbols can be used to describe the complexity of a hack or the level of access a criminal has to a stolen database. A 4 card might be used as a coded signal between insiders. These layers of meaning make the language a dense, multi-dimensional puzzle that requires a deep understanding of Russian criminal history to solve.
The constant evolution of the language is driven by the pressure of law enforcement. As soon as a particular piece of slang becomes widely known to investigators, the criminal community begins to phase it out in favor of something new. This creates a linguistic arms race. Cybersecurity analysts must not only track the latest malware and exploits, but also the shifting nuances of the language used to discuss them. They have to distinguish between the general slang of the Russian Internet and the specific coded expressions derived from Fenya. This hybrid communication style makes automated translation tools significantly less effective, as they often miss the hidden meanings and cultural connotations that are clear to an insider. The persistence of Fenya in the digital age is a testament to the resilience of the Ofenius' original invention. They created a system of communication that was designed to be adaptable, to absorb new influences, and to prioritize secrecy above all else. Whether it was the Greek and Yiddish borrowings of the 18th century or the technical jargon of the 21st, the core of the language remains the same. A way for a marginalized group to build an autonomous world that is hidden from the eyes of authority. The digital frontier has not replaced Fenya, it has provided it with a new global stage.
The language of the Russian underworld has traveled from the portable boxes of the icon peddlers to the barracks of the Gulag, then into the taverns of the Soviet Union and the boardrooms of the Kremlin, and finally into the encrypted servers of the dark web. At every stage, it has been a mirror of the society it inhabits, reflecting the shifts in power, the realities of survival, and the enduring strength of the criminal brotherhood. As artificial intelligence and global surveillance networks become more sophisticated, the question remains: will the ancient rhythms of the Ofenias continue to provide a shield for the outlaws of the future? Or will the cold logic of the machine finally crack the code of the thieves' cant?
Fenya's journey from the Suzdal roads to the dark web reveals more than just a secret lexicon. It mirrors the turbulent soul of Russia itself. What began as a peddler's shield against highwaymen evolved into a survival tool for the Gulag and, eventually, a strategic weapon for the Kremlin. This anti-language has proven remarkably resilient, adapting to every technological shift, from X-ray records to encrypted servers. Its broader implication is profound. When a criminal argot becomes a national dialect, the line between the law and the underworld blurs, transforming a culture's very perception of power and truth. Whether used by a hacker or a head of state, Fenya remains a testament to the enduring power of the outsider's voice. As we move further into a digital age of total surveillance, we must wonder, will Fenya remain an unbreakable code, or will the machine finally silence the thief's cant? Thank you for listening.